The stale scent of cheap disinfectant and stale beer clung to the air of the motel room, a familiar comfort to Ethan Wolfe. At 47, his face was a road map of forgotten highways and sleepless nights, etched with lines that spoke of more than just age. His hands, calloused and scarred, moved with practiced precision over the components of his bolt-action rifle. The metallic tang of gun oil blended with the faint, lingering smell of gunpowder, a peculiar perfume he had worn for 15 years. His current sanctuary was a roadside motel outside Bozeman, Montana, just a 2-hour drive from the western edge of Yellowstone National Park. The park, vast and wild, had been his hunting ground, his church, and his personal hell. He knew every game trail, every shadowed ravine, every whisper of the wind through the pines. He also knew the precise coordinates of a small, unmarked glade deep within its sprawling wilderness, a place forever seared into his memory. It was 2009, a family camping trip, a rare indulgence in the life of a man who usually preferred solitude. The memory still tore at him, a ragged wound that refused to heal. It was not a bear attack, as the Rangers had concluded. Ethan had seen enough bear kills to know the difference. Bears ate their prey, tore flesh for sustenance. His wife, Sarah, and their boy, Thomas, had been ripped apart, their bodies mutilated but not consumed. The ground around them had been churned, not by paws, but by something heavier. Something that left behind impressions unlike any animal he had ever tracked. He had caught only a glimpse, a distorted shadow moving with impossible speed, a snarl of pure, untamed fury. But it was enough to change him, to twist his grief into a singular burning purpose. His life became a testament to that purpose. He traded a mundane existence for the nomadic path of a hunter, an executioner of the things that preyed on humanity from the shadows. His methods were meticulous, born of relentless study and brutal experience. He observed, he tracked, he learned. He devised traps based on an understanding of their predatory instincts and their unnatural anatomy. Not just simple snares, but intricate mechanical devices designed to exploit the very weaknesses that made them so deadly. 23 times he had ended one of them. Each liquidation was a unique biological nightmare, a creature of twisted muscle and bone that defied conventional zoology. He called them changers for their ability to shift, to blend, to hide in plain sight. He knew their world, or so he believed. He understood the different strains of changers, the brute force variants that relied on sheer power, the agile, cunning stalkers that favored stealth, and the rare, insidious shapeshifters that could hold human form for extended periods. He knew their behaviors, their preferred hunting grounds, their aversion to certain metals, certain frequencies of sound. He was an expert, yet his knowledge was built solely on personal experience, on the bloody lessons learned in the field. He saw them as animals, albeit grotesque ones, driven by primal instinct and an insatiable hunger. They were not people. They were something else entirely, something to be eradicated. The low hum of his modified shortwave radio, usually a source of white noise, suddenly cut through the silence. It was not a squelch of static, nor the familiar crackle of an amateur band. It was a precise, urgent signal, a burst of data he did not recognize. His hand instinctively went for the volume dial, his fingers brushing against the cold metal of his rifle. The system, cobbled together from scavenged military-grade components and custom-built frequency filters, was designed to pick up specific, highly unusual energy signatures. signatures he had learned to associate with the changers. But this was not one of them. Then a voice, not distorted or garbled, but clear, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a synthetic voice, processed beyond recognition. It was not human, not quite, and it was not a changer's growl. Wolf, coordinates acquired. New vector, Appalachian Mountains, primary target, anomaly. Ethan froze, his thumb hovering over the safety switch of his rifle. Anomaly? That was not a term he recognized in the lexicon of his grim trade. His gut twisted, a knot of instinctive unease. No hunter he knew used such sterile language. No changer communicated like this. The voice continued, its tone flat, almost mechanical. The others, they fear it. You do not understand. This is not a changer. They fear it. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. They fear it. The changers. The monsters he had dedicated his life to hunting, the apex predators of the hidden world, were afraid of something. This was beyond his understanding, beyond anything he had ever encountered. The signal ended as abruptly as it began, leaving only the low hum of the radio and the deafening silence of the motel room. Ethan stared at the device, his mind racing. This was not a trap. It was both a warning and an invitation. It promised something new, something terrifying, and something that would finally give him the answers he had sought for so long. The hunt, he realized, was about to change. The message replayed in Ethan's mind like a broken record, the chilling phrase they fear it echoing in the quiet of his motel room. Every fiber of his being, honed by years of cautious, solitary pursuit, screamed caution. Yet a deeper, more primal instinct pulled him forward. This was not a typical signal from a fellow hunter, nor a plea for backup, nor a lead on a new pack. This was something else entirely, a rupture in the fabric of his known world. The sheer audacity of the unknown voice, the sterile precision of its words, and the terrifying implication of a threat that even the changers dreaded, compelled him. He had to know. Within an hour, his sparse belongings were packed into the back of his pickup truck. The truck was old, battered, and indistinguishable from countless others, perfect for blending into the forgotten corners of America. Maps unfolded on the passenger seat, showing faint lines of dirt roads and long-abandoned logging trails, the kind of routes he preferred. His worn flip phone remained powered off, its subscriber identity module card removed and stored in a Faraday pouch. Modern tracking, modern communication, these were weaknesses he could not afford. His journey to the Appalachians would be a phantom trail, leaving no digital breadcrumbs. The drive was long, stretching over 2 days, a blur of forgotten towns and vast, desolate landscapes. The weather mirrored his internal state. A perpetual gray sky, spitting rain that blurred the windshield, and a biting wind that carried a premonition of danger. He bypassed interstates, opting for winding state routes and county roads that cut through dense forests and isolated valleys. The further east he drove, the wilder the terrain became. The mountains rose like ancient hunched giants, their peaks shrouded in mist, their slopes thick with evergreen and deciduous trees, their roots clinging to crumbling rock faces. Signs of human civilization became increasingly scarce, then ceased to exist altogether. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt, the path barely wide enough for his truck. He passed deserted towns, the skeletal remains of old mining operations, rusting machinery half buried in the soil, and a few leaning empty farmhouses with shattered windows staring out like vacant eyes. The silence was profound, broken only by the hum of his engine, the drip of water from the trees, and the occasional cry of an unseen bird of prey. It was a silence that spoke of deep wilderness, of places where nature had reclaimed its dominance, and where what lurked within those shadows moved undisturbed. Following the precise, almost surgical coordinates from the radio, Ethan navigated a particularly treacherous, rutted track that ascended steeply into the heart of the wilderness. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The track ended abruptly at a narrow game trail, barely visible beneath a canopy of ancient oaks. He killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. The only sound was his own breath, and the slow, rhythmic thump of his heart against his ribs. He retrieved his rifle, the familiar weight a comfort in his hand, and began to move. The forest floor was thick with decaying leaves, making every step a crunching symphony. He moved slowly, deliberately, his senses extended, searching for anything amiss. His usual protocol upon entering a new hunt zone was to establish a perimeter, assess fresh tracks, and identify the active hunting patterns of his target. But here there were no fresh tracks, not in the way he understood them. Instead, less than a half-mile in, he found it. Not a hunting ground, but a charnel house. The remnants of a den torn apart, not simply abandoned. The scent of spilled blood, sharp and metallic, hung heavy in the cold air. But it was days old, almost dissipated. He found 2 bodies. 2 changers. He recognized the strain instantly. A pair of brutes, massive and powerful, usually a formidable challenge. But these 2 were inert, their monstrous forms twisted into grotesque parodies of life. Their fur was matted with dried blood, their eyes staring blankly at the indifferent sky. His initial reaction was the familiar surge of grim satisfaction. Another 2 down, but then he saw the details. The damage. These were not the clean, surgical kills he usually performed, nor were they the messy, instinct-driven kills of a pack warring among themselves. The bodies were ripped apart with impossible force, their limbs wrenched at unnatural angles, bones shattered and protruding through skin and fur. One changer's spine was clearly fractured in multiple places, its head twisted almost 180 degrees. The other had a gaping cavity in its chest, where something had torn out its vital organs. There were no claw marks, no bite marks consistent with another changer, no signs of a struggle. They had not been ambushed, they had been annihilated. Ethan knelt, examining the torn flesh, the splintered bone. The wounds were precise in their brutality, almost methodical. This was not the work of a human hunter, not even the most skilled. It was not the work of a poacher, and it definitely was not the work of another changer. He had encountered rare cases of changers fighting to the death, but never with this level of overwhelming, one-sided destruction. This was something else, something utterly unprecedented in his long, bloody career. A new predator had entered the ecosystem he thought he knew, and it hunted the very things he considered to be the ultimate predators. His skin crawled with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather. The discovery of the annihilated changers shifted Ethan's entire paradigm. His years of experience, his meticulously catalogued knowledge of his prey, suddenly felt obsolete. He was no longer hunting a changer. He was hunting whatever hunted changers. This was a new tier of challenge, one that demanded every ounce of his skill, every instinct honed by decades in the wilderness. He was entering a new game, and the rules were entirely unknown. His first move was to establish a perimeter, but not for defense. This time, it was to ensnare. He moved with swift, silent efficiency, deploying his specialized equipment. From his pack, he drew out an array of thermal sensors, compact devices designed to detect even the faintest heat signatures. He camouflaged them meticulously among the undergrowth, burying them beneath layers of leaves and moss, their tiny lenses scanning the forest. He set them to catch a glimpse, to record a thermal imprint of the warm-blooded yet utterly non-human anomaly responsible for the carnage. Next, the bait. He dragged the remains of one of the dead changers further into a clearing, a morbid offering. The stench of decay was thick, but he knew the raw, primal scent of spilled changer blood would draw the unknown entity out. It was a risky move, but he needed a reaction, a sign that his quarry was receptive to conventional lures. Alongside the carcass, he placed several small disc-shaped devices, ultrasonic emitters. These devices, when activated, emitted high-frequency sounds, imperceptible to the human ear, but agonizing to the sensitive hearing of changers. He had seen them flee, disoriented from the mere presence of such frequencies. He deployed them to test if this new entity reacted similarly, or if its biology rendered it immune. Finally, he collected a small vial of blood from the ripped chest cavity of one of the changers. He did not know what use it would be, but blood as a biological marker was universal. It would either attract or simply serve as a baseline for future analysis. Every piece of his equipment, every tactic he employed, was an extension of his rigorous, systematic approach to the hunt. But as he set the last sensor, a chill wind swept through the trees, carrying with it a distinct sense of being watched. He spent the next 24 hours meticulously exploring the territory. He moved like a shadow, his eyes scanning every rock, every tree, every patch of disturbed earth. He searched for patterns in the destruction, for possible routes of ingress and egress, for any sign of a lair or temporary shelter. His tracker's instinct was acute, but something about this forest felt different. The very trees conspired to conceal the truth, their dense canopy and tangled undergrowth swallowing any trace. He felt a profound sense of disorientation, a reversal of roles he was not accustomed to. The first direct sign came not from his sensors, but from his gut. A faint rustle in the leaves that was not wind. The snap of a twig that felt too deliberate, too heavy for a deer. He would freeze, rifle raised, his eyes piercing the gloom, but see nothing. Yet the feeling persisted, the undeniable sensation of unseen eyes tracking his movements. He was no longer the sole predator in this domain. He was being studied. The realization hit him with a jolt of cold dread when he discovered his first thermal trap destroyed. Not just tripped or dislodged, but systematically dismantled. The casing was cracked, its delicate internal components crushed. It was not an accidental breakage by an animal. It was a deliberate act, an act of understanding. He had meticulously camouflaged it, but the entity that found it did so with unnerving precision. He moved to check the other traps, a growing unease coiling in his stomach. The ultrasonic emitters were gone. Not displaced, not buried, just gone. The bait, the changer carcass, remained untouched, an unspoken message that it was not interested in sustenance. It was interested in him. The chilling realization dawned. This creature was not just powerful, it was intelligent. It was not reacting to his presence. It was learning from his methods. It was adapting. The hunter had become the hunted, and the most terrifying part was that his prey was not just evading him, it was playing a game. And it knew the rules of the game far better than he did. The silence of the forest, once a comfort, now felt like a shroud, hiding a predator that was always one step ahead. The chilling realization that he was no longer the apex predator, but the subject of observation, settled over Ethan like the perpetual chill of the Appalachian autumn. This creature was not a brute driven by instinct. It was sentient, adaptable, and chillingly perceptive. The notion of hunting it, of trapping it, now felt laughably naive. It was not a hunt. It was a game of cat and mouse, and Ethan was slowly, terrifyingly becoming the mouse. The thought sent a cold shiver down his spine, a sensation he had not truly felt since that night in Yellowstone. The creature began to respond to his actions, not with violence, but with calculated displays of its awareness. Ethan left a particular mark on a tree to guide his path, and later found a similar unnatural carving nearby, a jagged spiral, or a series of deep, deliberate gouges. Once, after he had used a specialized, almost archaic, iron-tipped arrow to mark a particularly dense thicket, he found the arrow embedded in the trunk of another tree, half a mile away, its fletching neatly removed. The entity was mimicking him, taunting him, demonstrating that it understood his every move, every subtle clue he left behind. The violation of his hidden caches was the most disturbing. He maintained several small, camouflaged supply drops throughout any active hunting ground. Emergency rations, spare ammunition, medical supplies, and sensitive electronics. These were locations he had chosen for their absolute obscurity, accessible only through arduous climbs or near impossible navigation. Yet one by one he found them compromised, not merely discovered, but systematically dismantled. His rations were scattered, not eaten but torn apart. His medical kit was upturned, gauze wrappers strewn, and the sterile packaging of his antibiotics pierced. Most unnerving was the destruction of a small encrypted data slate he used for mapping. It was not crushed or broken but warped, its internal circuitry melted, having been subjected to an intense, focused heat source. It was a targeted act, not of plunder, but of strategic denial. The entity was not only intelligent, it was studying him, anticipating his needs, and systematically dismantling his capabilities. The nights became a waking nightmare. Ethan rarely slept deeply in the field, his senses always alert. But now, every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He found himself waking in the dead of night, his heart hammering, convinced he was not alone. He would grab his rifle, sweep his low-light scope across the darkness, but see nothing. Yet the presence was palpable, a suffocating weight in the air. He felt its eyes on him, a silent, predatory gaze that peeled back the layers of his self-control. One night, the feeling was overwhelming. He was camped beneath a large, rocky overhang, the wind howling around him, masking any telltale sounds. He had built a small, carefully contained fire, its embers glowing faintly. He woke abruptly, his entire body rigid with a deep, primal certainty that he was no longer alone. The fire was almost out, just a few dying coals emitting a faint orange glow. The wind had died down to an unnatural stillness. He felt it closer now, a cold, heavy presence that absorbed all sound, all light. He could not see it, but he knew it was there, just beyond the reach of his limited vision, just outside the perimeter of his firelight. He reached for his hunting knife, a custom-forged blade he reserved for extreme close-quarters encounters. It was always within arm's reach, under his pillow, or strapped to his forearm when he slept. His fingers closed around empty air. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He scrambled up, spinning, his rifle snapping into position. The beam of his tactical flashlight cut through the darkness, sweeping across the forest, but it revealed nothing but trees and shadows. He stood there for long minutes, his breath ragged, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The feeling of being watched slowly receded, replaced by a lingering dread. When the first rays of dawn pierced the canopy, casting long, pale shadows across his temporary shelter, Ethan finally dared to lower his weapon. There, precisely at the edge of his makeshift cot, driven into the soft earth, was his knife. Its polished steel blade, still wet with dew, glinted ominously in the weak light. But it was not just dew. A dark, viscous smear coated the blade, a familiar coppery smell rising from it. Changer blood. Not his own. Ethan stared at the knife, his hand trembling as he reached for it. The creature had been there, inches from his head, while he slept. It had taken his knife, dipped it in the blood of one of his own kills, and returned it. It had the power to kill him. It had the power to end his hunt, his life, with a single, silent thrust. But it had not. It had chosen instead to deliver a message, a chilling display of its absolute dominance. It was not a threat. It was a revelation. The knife, with its cold, bloodied blade, became a grim talisman. It proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the entity was not only intelligent but possessed a predatory patience that surpassed anything Ethan had ever encountered. His conventional methods, his systematic approach to hunting had been rendered useless. He could not track what left no discernible prints, could not trap what understood his traps, could not fight what moved like a phantom. He had to force a confrontation. He had to lure it into a place where even its unnatural abilities would be constrained. He packed his remaining gear, the weight of his rifle feeling heavier than ever. His mind raced, calculating, assessing. There was one type of terrain, one natural choke point, that gave him an advantage: a mountain pass. A place where the land itself funneled movement, where open spaces were scarce, and where sound, even the slightest whisper, would echo through the narrow confines. He chose a specific pass, known only to a few, a treacherous high-altitude trail that snaked between two towering peaks. The ascent was brutal. A bitter wind whipped snow across his face, stinging his exposed skin. The air thinned with every foot of elevation, burning his lungs. The landscape was stark and unforgiving. Jagged rock faces, skeletal trees gnarled by centuries of wind and ice, and a deep, oppressive silence broken only by the howl of the wind. A full moon, pale and luminous, began to rise above the eastern ridge, casting long, distorted shadows across the desolate terrain. Every sound was amplified, every rustle of his clothing, every crunch of his boots on the packed snow, boomed in the vast emptiness. He was exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone, a single figure against the monumental indifference of the mountains. He had pushed himself to the very limits of his endurance, physical and emotional. He reached his chosen position just as the moon climbed high, painting the world in stark silver and charcoal. It was a narrow defile, barely 20 feet wide, with sheer rock walls rising on either side. He settled himself behind a cluster of snow-covered boulders, rifle resting on a makeshift bipod, his scope scanning the approach. His breath plumed in the frigid air. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm against the stillness. His hunter's senses, usually so reliable, were screaming contradictory signals. He felt the imminence of something vast, something powerful, yet also something unnervingly silent. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The cold seeped into his bones, but he ignored it. Every muscle was tensed, every nerve wire taut. He heard it then. Footfalls. Not the heavy, deliberate tread of a man, nor the padding of an animal. These were heavy, yes, but almost impossibly soft, betraying the movement of something immense with unnatural grace. It was the sound of something that should not exist, something that defied the laws of physics and biology. He gripped his rifle tighter, his finger settling on the cold steel of the trigger guard. His eye squinted into the scope, tracking the source of the sound. From the swirling snow and deep shadows at the far end of the pass it emerged. It was impossibly tall, nearly 10 feet in height, easily 3 times his own bulk. Its form was broadly humanoid, but warped, twisted into something alien and terrifying. Its skin was not fur or scales, but a dark, leathery hide, deeply wrinkled like ancient sun-baked clay. It absorbed the moonlight, a deeper shadow against the already profound darkness. Where a head should have been, there was an unnerving, perfectly circular aperture, a gaping void. Within this void, concentric serrated rings rotated slowly, silently, like gears in some impossible machine. And around the rim of this aperture, thin, coiling tendrils, at least a dozen of them, writhed and extended, twitching, constantly sampling the air, tasting scents, sensing vibrations. It was not a wolf, not a man, not an animal he had ever encountered. It was a nightmare given form, a living contradiction. Ethan, the seasoned hunter, the man who had faced down 23 unique horrors, felt a primal, gut-wrenching terror, unlike anything he had known. His breath hitched in his throat. His finger poised on the trigger froze. This was not a changer. This was something else, something older, something beyond his understanding. The creature stopped. It did not charge, did not roar, did not unleash the destructive fury Ethan had witnessed in the den. Instead, it stood at the mouth of the pass, its massive form silhouetted against the pale moonlight, its tendrils twitching around the circular void of its face. It observed him, taking him in, its impossible anatomy conveying an unnerving sense of scrutiny. Then slowly, deliberately it lowered itself, settling onto one knee in the deep snow. Ethan, his rifle still aimed squarely at its chest, his finger hovering over the trigger, remained frozen. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. This was not the behavior of a beast, or even a cunning predator. This was an act of deference and an offering. He watched, utterly bewildered, as the creature extended one of its massive 3-fingered hands towards him, its movements slow and precise. With care, the creature placed 3 objects onto the pristine white snow directly in front of him. The first was a claw, sharp, curved, wickedly pointed. It was unmistakably a changer's claw, easily 2 inches long, torn from the hand of one of the brutes he had found annihilated in the den. It was a weapon, a trophy. The second object was a shard of bone. Roughly the size of his thumb, it was pale and dense, tapering to a dull point. Ethan recognized it immediately. A canine tooth, ripped from the jaw of a changer, one of the same brutes. The tooth was scored with unnatural grooves, gnawed by something far stronger than any jaw he knew. The third object landed with a soft thump, almost lost in the silence of the pass. It was a small piece of faded fabric, roughly 2 inches square. A patch, an old, worn army patch with a faded, embroidered emblem. The insignia of the 101st Airborne Division, specifically the Screaming Eagle. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew that patch. He knew it intimately. He had kept one just like it, tucked away in his wallet for 15 long, agonizing years. It was Thomas's. His son had been wearing a replica, a gift from his uncle, that day in Yellowstone. The rifle slipped in Ethan's numb fingers, clattering softly against the snow. His breath hitched, turning into a ragged gasp. The patch. His son's patch. He had not seen it since that day. The entity knew. It knew his name, his mission, his deepest wound. The claw and the bone were tokens, trophies of its own kills. But the patch, that was a message, a devastating, intimate blow that shattered his carefully constructed world. It was not a threat. It was a revelation. His mind raced, desperately trying to connect the dots. The changers in the den, slaughtered with such brutal precision. The creature, omniscient in its awareness of his past, his purpose. And now, this. The ultimate proof. The patch from Yellowstone. The creature had been there. It had seen. It had known. Having delivered its chilling offering, the colossal entity began to rise. Its movements were slow, deliberate, unhurried. It turned, its dark, faceless head swiveling slightly towards the endless expanse of the mountains. Then, without a sound, without a whisper of displaced snow, it began to move. Its massive form dissolved into the swirling whiteness of the snow, becoming one with the shadows and the driving wind. It simply vanished, its presence erased, leaving Ethan utterly alone in the brutal cold. Ethan stood rooted to the spot, his body stiff, his mind reeling. The rifle lay forgotten at his feet. His hand, shaking uncontrollably, reached down and picked up the small, faded patch. The fabric was cold, brittle with frost, but it felt impossibly heavy in his palm. His finger, still aching from the cold steel of the trigger, was now useless, devoid of purpose. Everything he had believed, every justification for his 15-year crusade, had just been ripped away. The changers were monsters, yes, but the entity that hunted them, it had seen, and it had judged. In that terrifying moment, Ethan knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that this silent, monstrous judge had been there, on that terrible day in Yellowstone, and it had witnessed the very horror that had transformed him into a hunter. His vengeance, his life's solitary purpose, now felt like a hollow, bitter lie. The creature was gone, vanished into the swirling snow, a true phantom of the mountains, not a figment of his frost-bitten imagination. But the proof remained. The changer's claw, the broken tooth, and the small faded patch clutched tightly in his numb fingers. The patch. It was the key. It unlocked a terrifying possibility that clawed at the foundations of his existence. He was not just a hunter anymore. He was a witness. And the truth lay close by. His instincts, honed over years of tracking, pulled him forward, not towards escape, but towards a deeper understanding. He moved carefully, no longer searching for a target, but for answers. He scrutinized the ground where the creature had stood. The the slight indentations in the snow where its immense weight had settled. There was no trail, no discernible tracks leading away, just as he had expected. It moved like a phantom. It simply did not exist in a way that left physical traces. But the general direction it had come from, the subtle shift in the wind that carried an unnatural earthy scent, provided a vector. He began to search, methodically, his gaze sweeping over every rock face, every cluster of gnarled pines. The pass was treacherous, but he knew its hidden crannies, its secret ledges. And then he saw it. It was not obvious. Just a slight unevenness in the rock face, a thin veil of snow clinging to what looked like a solid wall. But a subtle discoloration, a hint of deep shadow where no shadow should be, drew his eye. He approached cautiously, his rifle held ready, knowing it would do him no good against a creature that materialized and vanished at will. As he got closer, the deception became clear. A natural overhang, draped with thick ancient vines and camouflaged with a layer of wind-blown snow, concealed a narrow opening. It was not a den or a lair. It was a doorway. He squeezed through the tight entrance, descending into a cavern carved deep into the mountain. The air within was still cold and dry, carrying a faint, musty odor. His flashlight beam cut through the absolute darkness, revealing a sight that made his blood run cold, then boil with a horrifying realization. It was a chamber, vast and echoing, its walls rough and uneven, and it was filled with bones, not scattered indiscriminately, like the remains in an animal's lair, but arranged with a chilling, meticulous order. Skulls of changers, large and small, were stacked in precise pyramids. Femurs, ribs, and vertebrae were laid out in geometric patterns on ledges carved into the cave walls. It was a macabre exhibition, a trophy room far beyond human comprehension. But it was not just changer bones. Mixed among them, in equally disturbing displays, were human bones. And alongside the bones, carefully placed, almost curated, were personal effects. A tarnished wedding ring next to a fragmented human skull. A child's faded crayon drawing tucked beneath the femur of a brute. A locket, its clasp broken, spilled open to reveal a miniature photograph of a smiling young woman. A handwritten letter, its ink smeared with age and moisture, lay beside a changer's jawbone. There were trinkets, amulets, even a small leather-bound diary, its pages brittle. These were not the random leavings of a predator. These were mementos, relics. Ethan moved through the chamber, his flashlight beam trembling. He recognized some of the items. A silver locket similar to one he had seen in a cold case file from rural West Virginia. A small, handcrafted wooden bird identical to one reported stolen from a tourist in a national park 2 states away. Each item, he realized with dawning horror, corresponded to a reported disappearance, a cold case, an unsolved tragedy that authorities had attributed to accident or animal attack, or simply allowed to fade into forgotten memory. And then he saw it. In a recessed alcove, illuminated by a faint, almost ethereal glow from a natural fissure in the rock, was a tableau that turned his blood to ice. Neatly arranged on a flat, smooth slab of stone were more human bones. Among them, a woman's skeletal hand, adorned with a simple gold wedding band. And next to it, the tiny, fragile bones of a child, no older than 7. And beside them, carefully positioned, was a small, tattered scouting patch, faded green with a yellow border. Not the 101st Airborne Division, but another, just as poignant. He knew with a certainty that twisted his gut that these were the bones of victims, the families whose lives had been cruelly snuffed out, cases that had echoed the very tragedy that had shaped him. The cave was not a den. It was a repository, a cold, silent testament. The creature had not simply killed these changers, it had judged them. Each bone, each personal item, was evidence. Evidence of a crime, a transgression. This horrifying alien entity was not merely a hunter, it was a collector, a witness, a judge, and an executioner. Ethan's 15 years of vengeance, his single-minded crusade, had been built on a lie. He had been killing monsters, but this thing was punishing them. The silence of the cavern pressed in on Ethan, broken only by the ragged sound of his own breathing. The air, heavy with the scent of dried blood and ancient dust, vibrated with a terrible truth. He had spent 15 years chasing shadows, convinced he was the sole arbiter of justice in a world of monsters. But here, in this chilling chamber of verdicts, he found proof that a far older, far more discerning justice existed. The changers, the monsters he had hunted with such single-minded ferocity, were not all equal. There were shades of malevolence, degrees of transgression. And the entity he had pursued, the one he had perceived as a nameless horror, was their judge. He knelt before a display of shattered human femurs and the tattered remains of a child's toy. His mind replayed every kill he had made, every changer he had put down. Had he truly understood their motives? Had he distinguished between the rogue, the truly evil, and those merely driven by base instinct or even fear? No, he had not. He had seen them all as a single, homogeneous threat, an echo of the creature that had destroyed his family. His hunt had been a blind, all-consuming vendetta, a desperate attempt to excise the pain from his own soul through the barrel of a rifle. He had not been a deliverer of justice. He had been an instrument of destruction, a force of vengeance, indistinguishable in its single-mindedness from the very things he hunted. The creature he had believed to be the ultimate monster was, in fact, something else entirely. It was a guardian, a grim reaper, a natural force of balance, maintaining an equilibrium he had not known existed. Its actions, though horrifying in their scale and brutality, had a clear, terrible purpose. It was not about consumption or territory. It was about retribution. It hunted those changers who preyed on the innocent, those who crossed an unspoken line, those who committed acts of pure, unadulterated evil against humanity. The bones and personal effects were its irrefutable evidence, its silent judgments. The difference between them was stark, a chasm Ethan could not bridge. He had killed out of grief, out of a need for personal retribution. The creature acted with a cold, almost divine impartiality. It made choices. It bore the weight of its responsibility. Its vengeance was an act of terrible justice, a balancing of scales far beyond the ken of human law. The patch, Thomas's patch, still clutched in his hand, vibrated with a new, agonizing weight. It was not an accusation from the entity, but a silent question. "Do you understand now?" The creature had shown him. It had been there, that day in Yellowstone. It had seen what truly happened, and it had judged the perpetrator. Ethan had chased after a phantom of a monster, while the true judge had already delivered its verdict. The realization settled deep within him, cold and absolute. His path as a hunter was over. The singular purpose that had consumed him for 15 years, that had given his shattered life its grim structure, had evaporated. He could not, would not continue his blind vendetta. Not now. Not when he knew there was a greater, more profound force at work, meting out a justice he could never have conceived. He had glimpsed a truth that changed everything, a truth that shattered his world, but paradoxically also offered a strange, unsettling peace. The weight of his burden, the constant, gnawing need for vengeance, began to lift, replaced by a profound, almost paralyzing emptiness. Ethan emerged from the cavern, leaving behind the chilling testament of the Judge of Shadows. The biting mountain air, once an adversary, now felt like a cleansing balm against his skin. He was hollowed out, stripped bare of the single-minded obsession that had defined him for 15 years. Yet amidst the profound emptiness, a strange, nascent sense of relief began to unfurl within him, like a flower struggling to bloom in winter. The weight of his burden, the perpetual thirst for vengeance, had finally lifted. He descended the treacherous pass, his movements mechanical, each step a deliberate effort. His eyes, though still sharp, no longer scanned the terrain for threats, but for a new direction, a path forward in a world that had suddenly become alien to him. He returned to the place where he had dropped his rifle in shock. It lay half buried in the snow, a cold, dark sentinel. He stared at it for a long moment, the familiar weight of the weapon no longer a comfort, but an accusation. It was the instrument of his blind retribution, a symbol of the life he had just left behind. With a deep, shuddering breath that frosted in the cold air, Ethan leaned the rifle carefully against the entrance to the hidden cave. Its silhouette was stark against the dark mouth of the cavern, a silent declaration. It was a symbolic act of renunciation. He was abandoning his tools, severing his ties to the violence that had defined his existence. He was no longer a hunter. The rifle, once an extension of his will, was now a forgotten monument to a past life. He did not know where to go. He did not know what to do. His entire identity had been wrapped around the pursuit of vengeance. That purpose was now obsolete, replaced by a profound, disturbing knowledge. He was a man without a mission, adrift in a world he no longer understood. The thought of reintegrating into normal society felt impossible. How could he, a man who had seen the terrifying, methodical justice of the shadows, simply walk into a grocery store or sit in a diner? The world he had meticulously mapped, the clear lines between monster and victim, had collapsed. He was no longer the hunter, but a traumatized observer. He was a witness to a truth that transcended human understanding, a truth that would brand him insane if he ever dared to speak it aloud. He was a keeper of a terrible secret, and that secret isolated him further than any remote cabin or forgotten motel ever could. A new purpose, vague and undefined, began to stir within him. He would not hunt changers anymore. The Judge of Shadows, that ancient, terrifying entity, made the choices. It carried out the grim sentences against the truly monstrous. Ethan had merely been a crude, blunt instrument. But if he was not a hunter, what was he? The answer was a terrifying blank slate. He would have to find a new meaning, a new way to exist in the shadow of this profound revelation. He would have to learn to live with the knowledge that ultimate justice was not always human, not always understandable, and often utterly horrifying. His path, though still undefined, would begin away from the violence, away from the obsession, away from the blinding rage that had consumed him for so long. The descent from the mountains was a physical journey, But the return to civilization felt like a passage between dimensions. Ethan Wolfe had spent 15 years as a phantom moving through society's fringes, his life defined by the pursuit of vengeance. Now, the weight of his rifle gone, replaced by the crushing burden of a truth too vast to articulate, he felt like an alien. He tried to blend in, to become just another face in the crowd, but every interaction was a struggle. His social skills, long atrophied, felt like a foreign language he had forgotten how to speak. He was wary, his eyes constantly scanning, not for changers, but for the elusive patterns of normalcy, for clues on how to act. He stopped at a diner, the aroma of sizzling bacon and stale coffee assaulting his senses. The clatter of cutlery, the murmur of conversation, the blare of a television. It was a symphony of ordinary life, overwhelming in its sheer volume. He ordered a black coffee, his voice rough from disuse. The waitress, a plump woman with a kind smile, noticed his worn clothes and the distant look in his eyes, but said nothing. He found himself dissecting her, every movement, every subtle shift in expression, searching for a hidden truth, a tell that would confirm her humanity. Years of suspicion had etched itself onto his soul, and it refused to be scrubbed away. He started reading local newspapers, something he had not done in years. The headlines were full of petty crime, political squabbles, and celebrity gossip. But sometimes, buried deep in the regional sections, he found a small article. Hiker vanishes in local woods, unexplained farm animal mutilations, family found deceased in remote cabin bear attack suspected. Before, these would have been leads, potential targets. Now, he saw them through a new lens. He saw the subtle, horrifying hallmarks of the changers and the chilling, precise work of the judge of shadows. He saw the world's hidden underbelly, the truth that most people would never acknowledge. His past, however, was not so easily discarded. In a gas station in rural Tennessee, as he paid for a full tank, the elderly attendant peered at him through thick spectacles. "You look familiar, son. Ethan Wolfe, ain't it? Used to hear tales about you, back in the day. The Wolf of the West, they called you. Heard you quit that private work." The man's voice was raspy, his eyes sharp. Ethan merely grunted, a non-committal sound. "Things change," he managed, his voice devoid of inflection. He felt a flicker of the old urge to confide, to hint at the terrifying reality he had witnessed. But the words died in his throat. How could he explain the unexplainable? How could he tell this kindly old man that true justice walked on three-toed feet, with an impossible void where its head should be? The internal conflict was a constant, gnawing presence. His mind was a battlefield. One part craved the lost innocence of a normal life, the simple rhythm of a day without the specter of monstrous evil. The other part, the part that had stood in the chamber of verdicts, knew that such a life was a fragile illusion. He had seen the truth. He understood the hidden dangers. The world was full of terrors that operated just beyond the veil of human perception, and he, now uniquely equipped, understood them. He felt a strange, detached responsibility, not to hunt, but to observe, to know, to understand, and to protect, in ways he had not yet fully grasped. The hunter was gone, but what remained was a sentinel, burdened by a truth too terrible, too profound for words. The yearning for normalcy warred with the undeniable pull of the unknown. Ethan, living out of his truck, moving from one forgotten small town to another, found himself drawn back to the periphery of the life he had abandoned. He started making subtle inquiries, using old aliases and long dormant contacts. A network of fringe researchers, paranoid former government agents, and local folklorists who dabbled in the unusual. He never revealed his true identity or his recent revelations, instead presenting himself as a curious academic, a collector of strange tales. "Heard a story about an odd incident up north," Ethan said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on some distant point. "Something about a large animal attack. Unusually brutal. Any similar cases out this way?" He was fishing, not for leads to hunt, but for patterns, for echoes of the judge's grim work. He needed to confirm his understanding, to verify how the world beyond the Appalachian Mountains mirrored the terrifying justice he had witnessed. Despite his attempts to blend in, to become invisible, the years of living on the edge had left an indelible mark. He could not shake the sensation of being watched. It was not the menacing, intelligent scrutiny of the judge, but a diffuse, persistent paranoia, a lingering consequence of years spent always on guard. Every shadow shifted, every distant car slowed. He knew it was largely psychological, a phantom limb of his hunter's instincts, but it was relentless. He felt like a broken man, still waiting for the ambush that would never come. His research led him down rabbit holes of local legends and forgotten histories. He pored over dusty library books, microfiche archives, and obscure online forums dedicated to cryptids and unsolved mysteries. He found countless stories of wild beast attacks and unexplained disappearances in remote areas, cases that had baffled local authorities. Before, he dismissed these as circumstantial, attributing them to common changers. Now he saw the faint, unsettling patterns, the lack of signs of struggle, the peculiar mutilations, the absence of devoured remains. These were not random acts of animalistic violence. They were the signatures of the judge, clear as day to his newly opened eyes. He was seeing the world as it truly was, a terrifying tapestry woven with the threads of human life and hidden ancient forces. He found mentions of Old Man Stitches, a local legend in a few isolated Appalachian communities. A towering figure said to appear after unspeakable evils were committed, leaving behind only the torn bodies of the perpetrators and a strange, deep quiet. He saw it now as a folk memory, a distorted account of the judge's work, passed down through generations. He cross-referenced these stories with his own mental catalog of past changer kills. Had he, in his blind vengeance, eliminated changers that the judge would have ignored? Or worse, changers that the judge was already pursuing? The thought was a bitter pill. He had interfered with a system he did not even know existed. There were moments, sharp and sudden, when the old hunter's instinct flared. He had read news reports of children gone missing and families massacred, both attributed to random transients. And he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the desire to grab his rifle, to track, to punish. His hands would clench, the phantoms of his lost family whispering in his ears. But then, the image of the cavern, of the meticulously arranged bones, of Thomas's patch, flooded his mind. The judge. It was out there. It was watching. It was acting. And he, Ethan Wolfe, was no longer needed for that particular form of justice. The temptation to return, to dive back into the comforting clarity of black and white vengeance, was immense. But the knowledge he now carried was a shield protecting him from his past self. He would observe. He would learn. and one day he would understand his new place in this terrifying, revelation-filled world. The internal struggle between his past as a hunter and his present as an observer intensified. The whispers of the past, the pull of the familiar, were strong. But the revelations of the mountain cave had fundamentally altered his perspective. He no longer saw just monsters. He saw a system. His cautious research and subtle inquiries led him to a cluster of cases in rural Georgia. A series of random disappearances and small-scale acts of violence, broken into homes, stolen vehicles, but no witnesses, no apparent motive. Local authorities dismissed them as transients or petty thieves. But Ethan saw the signs. A distinct lack of physical evidence, an unnatural silence around the crime scenes, and a pattern of victims who, upon closer inspection, were far from innocent. A local drug dealer, a man suspected of child exploitation, a corrupt small-town official. These were not random, and they were not human. Ethan moved into the area, not to hunt, but to monitor. He set up discreet surveillance, using long-range lenses and audio recorders, observing from a distance. He spotted them, changers, but of a different strain than he was accustomed to. Smaller, more insidious, capable of blending seamlessly into human society. They were the kind that did not rely on brute strength, but on manipulation, fear, and quiet depravity. He saw one, a thin, unassuming man, transform for a fleeting moment. A twitch of elongated fingers, a flash of red eyes, as he threatened a local shopkeeper. The old Ethan would have struck, swift and lethal. But this new Ethan held back. He did not intervene with violence. Instead, he used his knowledge to subtly disrupt their operations. He anonymously tipped off a local newspaper about a suspicious land deal, and left a cryptic, untraceable message for the county sheriff about a forgotten warrant. He made just enough noise, created just enough chaos, to force these changers into the open or compel them to relocate without directly engaging them. He was still protecting, but without a bullet. An old contact, a grizzled private investigator named Marcus Thorne, who had occasionally passed him leads in the past, reached out. Wolf, Thorne's gravelly voice crackled over the secure burner phone Ethan occasionally used. Got a big one. Something out of Arizona. Nasty. Looks like a pack's gone feral. Locals are calling it a cult, but the details... They scream changer. You in? Ethan paused. The familiar rush of adrenaline a bitter temptation. No, Thorne. My hunting days are over. There are other forces at work. Things you would not understand. He kept his voice steady, revealing nothing. Thorne grunted, sounding confused, but did not press. Suit yourself, Wolf. Never pegged you for the retiring type. Ethan hung up, a pang of something akin to loss, but quickly overshadowed by the profound clarity of his new understanding. His continued historical research brought forth more clarity about the Judge of Shadows. He found obscure texts, ancient myths from forgotten tribes, referencing names like Silent Arbiter and Watcher from Beyond, names for an entity that ensured balance between the worlds. It was described not as a god, but as an ancient, primal species, existing outside the linear progression of human or changer evolution. Its role was not to destroy, but to correct, to prune, to maintain order through terrifying, absolute judgment. It was a living, sentient force of nature, an ecosystem's immune system targeting the infection. Ethan found himself at a precipice. He could not go back to his old life. He could not ignore the truth he now carried. But he also could not simply disappear. His duty was no longer to avenge, but to understand. To understand the judge, to understand its methods, to understand the true nature of the changers it hunted. He needed to reconcile his past with this new, terrifying reality. He began to prepare, not for a hunt, but for a future encounter. He still carried a firearm, but its purpose had shifted from offensive to defensive. He developed new protocols for observation, for data collection, for tracking the subtle ebb and flow of this hidden war. He was learning to be a sentinel, a silent witness. He did not know if he would ever truly meet the judge again, or if it would ever seek him out. But he stood ready for its appearance, not to fight, but to observe, to learn, and to finally understand his place in the terrifying hidden machinery of justice. The road stretched long and empty before Ethan struck, a reflection of the profound solitude that had become his constant companion. For years that solitude had been a shield, protecting him from the pain of his past, allowing him to focus on his grim purpose. Now it was a heavy cloak, amplifying the terrifying truth he carried. He was alone with a secret that few could fathom, a knowledge that set him apart from every living soul he encountered. The weight of it was immense, a silent burden that defined his new, uncertain existence. His memories of Sarah and Thomas, once a wellspring of agonizing grief and burning vengeance, began to transform. The sharp edges of pain softened, replaced by a deep, aching tenderness. He no longer saw only their tragic end, but their vibrant lives. Sarah's infectious laugh, Thomas's curious questions, the warmth of their hands in his. These memories were not fuel for his hunt anymore. They were reminders of what it meant to protect, to love, to cherish. And they were also a quiet affirmation that true evil, the kind that had taken his family, the kind the Judge of Shadows punished, should not be allowed to go unpunished. His desire for justice had not vanished. It had simply matured, broadened beyond the narrow confines of personal retribution. He spent countless hours in quiet reflection, driving through endless landscapes, the world outside a blur. He replayed every changer kill, every brutal confrontation, every moment of his 15-year crusade. Had every life he took been truly justified? Had every changer he eliminated been a genuine monster, one that the judge would have deemed worthy of its terrifying sentence? He could not know for certain. There was no going back, no way to undo the violence of his past. The uncertainty was a new kind of pain, a dull ache that settled in his chest. He had acted out of passion, out of a consuming need for vengeance. The judge acted with cold, deliberate precision. The difference was a stark judgment on his own methods. He was the unlikely guardian of a knowledge that could shatter global paradigms, upend human understanding of predators and justice. The existence of changers was one thing. The existence of an ancient entity that policed them, that exacted a gruesome form of capital punishment on the truly evil among them, was another entirely. He considered the implications, the sheer chaos such a revelation would unleash. Panic, denial, and a desperate attempt to weaponize or control the judge. None of it would end well. He understood now that some truths were too volatile, too profound to be shared. He would keep it secret. It was his burden, his responsibility. The ultimate lesson had been delivered not by a human, not by a book, but by a 10-foot-tall enigma with a void for a face. Justice, he learned, wore many faces. It did not always come with the familiar crack of a rifle, the cold bite of a knife, nor the sterile pronouncements of a courtroom. Sometimes it manifested as a terrifying ancient power moving through the shadows, delivering a brutal but necessary reckoning. He had thought himself an agent of justice, but he was merely a child, striking blindly in the dark. The judge was the true arbiter, a force of nature that ensured balance in a world that defied human comprehension. He was learning to live with that. He was learning to accept it. The decision was absolute, a quiet certainty that settled deep in Ethan's bones. He was no longer a hunter. The rifle, left propped against the mountain cave entrance, served as a final, immutable testament to that truth. His vengeance, once the bedrock of his existence, had crumbled, replaced by a strange, unsettling clarity. He had been a force of brute reaction, a man driven by a singular, consuming grief. Now he was something else, a witness, a sentinel. He accepted the chilling reality of the Judge of Shadows. It was not a monster to be slain, nor a riddle to be solved. It was a function, an ancient vital process in the hidden ecosystem of the world. It existed to maintain a terrible balance, to prune the truly malignant, those changers who transcended predatory instinct and devolved into pure, unadulterated evil. It was a horrifying truth, but it was truth, and in its brutal clarity, Ethan found a new kind of peace. The world was not chaos. It was a system far grander and more terrifying than he had ever imagined. His future stretched before him, an uncharted landscape. There would be no more obsessive tracking, no more meticulously cleaned weapons, no more silent vigils in abandoned motels. His days of blind vengeance were over, but he could not simply return to a mundane life, not with the knowledge he carried. He would find a way to live in harmony with this profound understanding, to exist on the fringes, observing, learning. He became a chronicler, silently documenting the patterns of evil and the chilling responses of the judge. He became a quiet protector, using his knowledge to subtly steer victims away from harm, to expose the changers the judge had not yet deemed worthy of its attention. But always from the shadows, without violence, without fanfare. He left behind the world of the hunt, the world of fear and raw, consuming vengeance. The dusty maps of hunting grounds were folded away, the worn leather of his combat boots replaced by more conventional footwear. He sold his truck for a nondescript sedan, its anonymity a new kind of camouflage. He would learn to navigate the complexities of human interaction, to find a semblance of a normal life, but always with the underlying awareness of the true nature of reality. Ethan Wolfe looked out at the rising sun, its golden light painting the eastern sky. He no longer sought to control or to destroy the unknown. He accepted its existence, its rules, its terrifying logic. There were forces at work in the world far beyond human grasp, and he, the former hunter, had been granted a glimpse behind the curtain. He had learned that justice was not always comforting, not always merciful, but sometimes utterly necessary. And in accepting this, in finding his place not as an executioner, but as a silent guardian of a terrifying truth, Ethan Wolfe, the man who had lost everything, began to find a new purpose, a new dawn in a world forever changed.